Welcome back to the Everything Sucks Now What podcast. And today I'm going to do a thing where I'm kind of doing a ask me anything or frequently asked questions, but I'm not getting one specifically. This is a question that I've gotten for 10 years. And the question is, can people change? I've been asked this more times than I can count, and I'm going to answer it. So it's a little different format. I don't really have any notes. I kind of just wrote out questions that I'm asked and how I move through my thought process. And I'm just going to talk and we'll see what happens. So why do I think that this is one of the most common questions? First of all, people ask the question, can people really change, to mentors and coaches and therapists and anyone in self-help, medical professionals, celebrities? And I think the answer is that because the question underneath all the other questions, right? Like, this is what we want to know because we feel like it informs everything. Nobody is really asking about their own habits, their own patterns, their own communication style. They're asking, like, am I stuck like this? And if we feel like we are, that's terrifying. So we do that thing with external validation and polling, and we outsource the big question to someone who seems like maybe they figured it out. So then when someone asks me, can people actually change? What are they actually asking? What is actually underneath this question? So I believe at the core, people are either hoping that they can actually change, right? But they also kind of want validation and a reason to maybe even blame their own lack of change or the lack of change in other people in their own lives, right? Why can't people change? So it's like, if someone in your life is really frustrating and they're not making the claims and the promises that they're not fulfilling them, or you're not trusting yourself and you can't seem to do the thing that you want to do, it would be a lot more comforting maybe to be able to say, well, it's because people fundamentally cannot change. I think half of the people are looking for permission to believe that they actually can change, that this is possible. And then maybe the other half really want a good reason to explain why they haven't, why the other people in their lives haven't. And honestly, I think most people actually do want both at the same time, which is why my answers are always nuanced and going to end up disappointing someone because we really do tend to think in black and white. So then the next question would be, is there a tension between wanting to believe that change is possible and then also wanting a reason to explain why it hasn't happened yet? If we want the both, what is happening underneath of that? And I think there is absolutely tension and no judgment because I have been there. I continue to go there. We find it a lot easier to just say, this is who I am, than to sit with the discomfort of this is who I ended up becoming. And maybe I had some say in that. And they both feel really accurate. They both feel true. And I don't think that either one is the whole truth. Like that's literally this podcast. Everything sucks now. What? We're acknowledging the circumstances and then we're seeing like, what can we do about it? So what's the answer? Can people change? Well, yes and no. And I know that's annoying, but stay with me. I think that we come in with a self, like an essence, a core foundation of who we are. So if we're looking at nature versus nurture, this would be nature. There's a version of you that exists before the world gets its hands on you, right? I always use the example of a stand-up comedian because that's something that I care about. And when they first are about to go on stage for the very first time, that's their most real self. But what happens is when you get up there, you get nervous, maybe you get heckled, whatever, and you maybe shift into adopting other people's styles. And the people's styles that you adopt are never really going to be somebody that you don't like. They're going to be somebody that you admire, someone that you think is really good at what they're doing. So once a stand-up comedian starts, they're almost immediately kind of shifting into adopting, mimicking someone else. And they're removing themselves from that essence of who they were, which is why they wanted to get on the mic in the first place, right? And that core essence of who we are that exists before the world manipulates, traumatizes us, whatever. This is who we are before we learn what's acceptable, what makes people uncomfortable, what we try to hide in order to be loved. I think that our baseline is before all those things enter. And I don't think it's a mystical woo-woo kind of thing. It's just like, who were you before you started needing to perform? So if we start at this baseline, the core self, then what happens to it? What moves us away from it? So it's pretty much specifically the hard parts of life. Trauma is an obvious one. If you experience something, I mean, trauma by definition is whenever you do something as a result of something else. So if there's a stimulus, there's an experience, and then your behavior changes in response to that. That's trauma. But I think a subtler answer that's included in this is like if there's a parent who laughed at the thing that you loved, or you were bullied for it, or the friend group made you feel that you were really weird for doing what you do, liking what you like, dressing how you dress, then these years and years of tiny adjustments to feel like you're staying safe, that moves you away from your baseline. And then eventually you maybe feel like you don't even really recognize yourself anymore. Or potentially worse is that you do think that this is you. And this is backed by real research. I mean, personality science has long held that, our traits, our personalities are largely stable and they are largely inherited. But in the American Psychologist, they did this, it's like the Personality Change Consortium. I think that's, yeah. And they found that like while traits remain relatively stable, they can change, especially if we have years of sustained effort and major life events. So the baseline is real, it is biological, but it's also very stubborn. That doesn't mean that it's not movable, though. So when I talk about trauma and environment that are affecting our essence, our baseline, some more maybe concrete examples of what this drift from your own baseline looks like would be if you loved art as a kid and became an accountant, and then you just tell everybody that you're fine with it. That's not really what you want to do. Maybe you are naturally loud and happy, but you get quieter and quieter because the world keeps telling you that you're being rude. Or the opposite, you're naturally quiet, but people mistake that for uninterested or apathetic. And I think that another really important thing is this doesn't always come from trauma. This comes from like, well, it's kind of the same thing, but it's rebellion as well. Sometimes rebelling ends up being the opposite of who you are. Like if your baseline is soft and curious and you become someone who's really hard and cynical because being soft, feels like it's going to be too vulnerable and get you hurt. I mean, when I was a kid, I was very naturally interested in things like that were bordering between science and mystical. I loved looking into astrology and auras and things that couldn't necessarily be explained. But because my mom was naturally interested in those things and I had a negative relationship with my mom, I pushed those things away and decided that I wasn't going to do anything that she did. And that is ultimately coming from a fear that I don't want to be like her. And if this road leads me there, I don't want to do that. Right. But I think we do this a lot. We're like, well, I'm going to rebel against this thing. And we need to know why. We need to know why we're rebelling against a thing. If we're rebelling against something that is actually part of our baseline, we're actually still moving away from the baseline. And research supports that too. I mean, your trauma absolutely can alter the course of your identity development. It can destabilize existing identity commitments. And it really impacts the internal resources that someone is bringing to their own identity or their own identity work. And then there's the author of The Body Keeps the Score. I always forget his name. It's like Bessel van der Kolk, which I know is a relatively controversial resource, but that body does show how trauma very much reshapes our bodies and our brains. And we compromise our capacities for things that feel good, right? Dopamine, pleasure, engagement, but also feeling like we have the ability to trust ourselves and that we have built like a sense of control. So when we're talking about how people drift from who they were and they will either like forget who they were, they'll mask it, they'll hide it, they'll numb out. That's where addiction comes in too, right? It's not really a metaphor. It is based in neuroscience. I think what happens is we, again, start with a baseline, but then whether we're so sensitive to the critiques or we're thinking that that critique is valuable or we're shamed into hiding something, suppressing it or completely changing it, that's when we move further away from our baseline. And I think that something that might be uncomfortable is like when we're talking about change, sometimes the change is concealment. So we celebrate people for changing when they get like serious or when they stop being so loud or so sensitive, when they finally stop caring as much. But sometimes that's not growth. Most of the time it's not. It's an armor. And it's not a personality. It's like just, it's coping, right? We're adjusting. And every time we do that, we move further away from our baseline. The thing is, I don't feel like we really have great language for the difference. You know what I mean? Like we change, but we're not necessarily identifying like, why is this happening or where is it coming from? And research backs this up too. When shame is pervasive, it paralyzes our ability or our trust in being spontaneous. And if we have like a really intense, chronic sense of lack of self-worth, like unworthiness, it results in depression and hopelessness and despair. And then that merges into becoming numb and dissociated and disconnected. There's also brain imaging that supports that too. There's like, what is it? It's an MRI study, but it begins with an F. I think it's just fMRI. And they tracked where shame shows up in your brain. And when that happens, it correlates with low self-esteem and anxiety and guilt and perfectionism and addiction. So it's almost like most of the time, I think we're seeing something and we're like scared of that. We're shamed about it. And then we either decide, okay, well, because I'm scared of that, I'm going to rebel against it, even if it's an unconscious thought and action following it. Or we're like, okay, this isn't safe, so I'm going to hide it. And therefore, I'm going to move away from my baseline. And then a lot of the times what happens is when we start hiding something, because we're feeling so much cognitive dissonance, then we need to numb out in some way. And that's where addiction comes in. Because numbing is really efficient, you know, whatever you're using, shopping, substances, work, doom scrolling, being in codependent, toxic relationships, it really takes care of the job in the short term, you know? It creates distance between you and the thing that's painful, whatever it is. And if the painful thing is this dissonance of who you are and not feeling like yourself, then it's creating distance between you and everything else who you really are, right? So you're not really changing, you're kind of maybe muted, you know? And that just makes me think that I have my third book is an audiobook and it's inside of 111 FM and it's literally called Unmuted. So if you're interested in doing this more, then maybe check that out at uncustomary.org/111. But addiction behavior is like, we talk about neuroplasticity. This is a neuroplastic kind of event. The brain gets trained. It's a new habit to perform a particular thing, a behavior, a pattern. And eventually it just happens to be like the predominant priority and it's exclusionary to everything else, like the things that bring us genuine pleasure and the relationships and really meaningful work, you know? I don't think that addiction is really just a bad habit. I think it's our brain trying to rewire itself from who we are because we're moving towards a numbing coping skill mechanism. It's a way to hide very effectively and very deeply from ourselves, most importantly. And then with shame, when you're shamed out of who you are, whether it's your interests, your personality, whatever, I mean, is that functioning the same way as trauma? And I think that shame is really fascinating because it doesn't necessarily need a big traumatic event. Sometimes someone can tell you one thing one time, and then that thing that you love is now forever weird, embarrassing, too much, scary, unsafe, and you file it away. And then 10 years later, you're explaining away your own interests like you owe someone an apology for existing or having an opinion. And then that baseline just continues to get blurrier and more buried under someone else's opinion, even if it was a one shot. So then let's talk about the change, right? So now we're like, what do we do? If we just because we know this, what do we do? So everything sucks. Okay, but now what? So if the bad change is drifting away from yourself, what can good change look like? So I actually don't know that this is the same thing, honestly. I don't think it's becoming yourself again. I think it's remembering who you used to be. Like, oh yeah, that's what I actually like. I actually don't think that that's pretty. I actually think that this is more important. I actually like doing this. I used to do that. I remember. That's why I've always felt off. So it's almost like we start at the baseline and then we have the shame, the addiction, the trauma, the masking, and we move further and further away from our baseline. So when we change in a way that feels positive, we're not going all the way back up the spectrum. Our goal is to come right back center. When we feel the most like ourselves, that's back at our baseline. So bad change, quote unquote, is kind of like drifting us away from ourselves. And then good change brings us back. But sometimes we'll overcompensate, right? I think it's kind of like a shedding. And I would say shedding instead of building or growing, because if we say building, I think that we're implying that we're adding something new, you know? And I don't think that that's really what we're doing. I don't think that's what's happening in the most transformational, meaningful things that I have witnessed myself, including my own life. It's more like cutting something out, excavating kind of, you're removing what accumulated on top of you, whatever that is, because what's covering you up is the real you. That real thing was always there, but it might be super buried, you know? So we're not necessarily becoming someone new, we're just returning to who we already were, which is kind of wild because we will spend so much money and time trying to become something. But the most alive that I've personally ever felt is when I've recognized myself again, recognize something in me again. Not when I acquire a new trait, but when I come back to me. Now, does that mean that once you come back to baseline that you can't build off of that? Yes, you can. But it's almost like we're building upward instead of over here. Does that make sense? Like, so let's say we start here, trauma, addiction, shame, masking, we come back. And now you start to add habits and new things in your life that do feel like you. You're not going to the other side of the spectrum. Those habits, if they're coming from the real you, are really just amplifying who you are. They're not moving you like this. So we need to come back to baseline and then build like that. And then I think one of the things that's important to notice is that this slide back to baseline, let alone the building up with the amplification, is not an inevitable thing in our lives. This kind of change is not inevitable. And I mean that the shedding doesn't just happen because you want it to or because it's been enough time. You can go your entire life fully defended, fully armored, fully numb, and then you think that that's really you now. And it is a version of you, but it's not the realest you, right? Nobody is going to break in and force you to start getting rid of all the crap on top. That does require effort. And this is also backed by science. So a study tracked people who wanted to change their personality, and they found that the desire to change didn't actually predict or correlate to actual change in that specific area or direction. In fact, in some cases, people who had that desire actually ended up moving the other way. Because again, sometimes we'll overcorrect. A good example would be boundaries, right? So maybe you feel like you've been too people-pleasing and a doormat your entire life. And then in order to get back to yourself, you kind of miss this exit on the ramp at your baseline and you become even more guarded. You know what I mean? Wanting is not the same thing as changing. So something that would get in the way why people might never even start this process or make it back is the comfort. It's the safety. It's the armor that's technically working, right? It's just a different version of your life, but it is keeping you from feeling, I don't know, like the armor keeps you from feeling the pain, right? That's why we call it coping mechanisms. It's a defense mechanism. It's working for us. A lot of the process of shedding, coming back to yourself, it's like you have to feel things that the armor was protecting you from. And because that hurts so much, it's going to suck. And because it sucks, most people won't withstand it. They'll go back, they might even go further. A lot of people get to that door and then they just decide that the trade-off is not worth it. And I really do get that. So then something else that I get asked in this realm is like, is there a turning point that separates people from the beginning process of shedding, the beginning process of changing, the people who don't? And honestly, I really think that it's usually pain. It's a discomfort that might be bigger than the other kind of discomfort that you're feeling, you know? It's not really a motivating thing. It's not an inspirational post. It's pain. The cost of staying this version of you all the way over here on the spectrum, so far away from your baseline, if you become self-aware and frustrated and disconnected enough, there might be a point where you connect that this pain sucks more than the armor, right? And for some people, that moment comes early. Some people, it comes late. Some people, it never comes because we've gotten really good at managing the cost that it costs you. And then we also need support because this process of coming back, it's like you're exposing nerves and you need help while you do that. You need something to help you, someone, a team, supplements, whatever. You need someone to help you figure out what you're uncovering in that process. But the other thing too is honestly that like sometimes we'll start and we'll realize it and we're like, oh no, I'm done with that. And then we just kind of go back. So sometimes it's more of like a ping pong. Like we're over here, we realize, we start shedding, and then we go back, and then we come back more, and then we go back, and then we go back more. That's actually way more realistic in terms of what happens. So then the now what part to make it more actionable is that if this feels like you, if you know that you're not really at your baseline, let alone amplifying your baseline, the real you, and you know that you've drifted, what do you do? What do you start with? I think it's just trying to figure out things that feel wrong, but you can't even necessarily explain. It's not big, obvious stuff usually. It's like you walk past something, you're like, "Oh, I hate how that looks. I keep using this kind of toothbrush, but I feel like it's wrong size, like for my hands or my mouth." Little tiny things that you feel like you're tolerating over and over and over again. What's coming to my head is like when I walk past a pile in my house and I'm like, I really need to put that away. And how much better I feel when that space is cleared. It's like, what kind of piles are there in your life? Is it that you hate the way that you have to dress or that you are dressing or the way that you speak or the people that you're around? Like those are big things, but look for like the mini, mini, mini things inside of it, the micro elements that just feel wrong. And frankly, those are going to be easier to shift anyway. So when you start noticing what you're tolerating, that usually doesn't necessarily have anything to do with your circumstances, but like who you're becoming, right? So, what within your world that you're tolerating can you actually change? I think that's where the trail starts, just one next step at a time. And then the difference between someone who wants change and someone who actually will change is pretty important because I think that wanting to change still has the armor on it. It's just a thought, it's a dream, it's a hope, it's a desire, it's a pipe dream, it's a in the next life kind of thing. I hope someone drops this off at my doorstep, this change. But actually changing requires you to get curious about what kind of stuff you've built up on top of you, the sediment, the armor. And instead of just wishing it was different, you ask, why is this here? What is the reason? What is the root cause? What is it protecting me from? Can I look at it and acknowledge it in maybe like a little less of a subjective way and just be like, okay, that technically makes sense. I get why you did that. That's happening. And what are we going to do now that we know why? If we just want, we skip the discovery element of it. We just want the prize. And that's, I mean, that's proven too. I mean, you don't just want to change. That doesn't work. You need to want to change, right? Like you have to commit to doing things differently, how you think, how you behave. Treating your personality as a set of habits that requires dedication and repetition and strength and perseverance to shift this. And then if we look at addiction as well, like recovery from addiction, we can't shed alone, right? When shame is there, it keeps the nervous system in this shut down state. And your neuroplasticity kind of just goes offline, you know? You're so safe that you don't want to change. It's like almost feels impossible. We have to start listening to the little urges when we're feeling muted, when our learning is blocked, because that's when our change is kind of like almost inaccessible. You literally cannot rewire your brain when you're in deep shame. We have to have safety first. And that's why connection really matters so much in this process. And then the last question I have that I get with this is, have I changed or have I started shedding? And I have been shedding. I've been shedding for a long time. I continue to shed. I continue to ping pong. And I think another thing that maybe is worth mentioning is kind of like I've been using this visual of, being in the middle of the baseline and then moving over here and then maybe ping ponging back. But it's not the whole personality that ping pongs, it's little tracks. So it is deeply possible for you to have like a thread of your personality that comes back to the baseline. And then you even amplify that while there's 20 other threads that are still really far over because of shame or addiction or trauma or whatever, right? So you can do one thread at a time. And you might not ever get all the threads, but wouldn't you rather have at least one thread back at your real self and let alone be amplifying it, you know? Because I always say, like, I don't just want people to figure out that it's good to be weird, that it's good to embrace their uniqueness, to trust themselves. I want you to figure out who you are, and then I want you to turn it up to 11, amplify the hell out of it. And when I have come back to myself, when I pull these threads, I think people see that as change, but it's really, again, me becoming more myself relentlessly. And fair warning, it's a lot. Me, myself, and I are a lot. But being myself is a lot more sustainable than whoever I was pretending to be. So that's it for today on can people actually change? I'd love to know your thoughts. Remember that we're acknowledging the suck with everything sucks. And then what now? What are we going to do about it? Maybe now you have a slightly different framework to work with what changing actually means and why. So let me know if you have any questions, if you want something else specifically explained or examples, or what your opinion is on whether people can change and is it completely contradictory to what I said. All right. Thank you for listening. I will see you at the next episode. Bye.